Wendy Malick as an older Ellie? Sign me the fuck up. I think it's safe to say I'm pretty much over fantasy as a genre. It's not that I dislike it as a concept, it's just that for so long, fantasy has been one of the most stale and unimaginative genres in the universe. After Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons, the unique material in fantasy is pretty much gone. The only deviation is when people try to inject steampunk into it, and that's just two overtone cliches mixed into one. I've been desperate for some new material in the fantasy genre for a long time, preferably something that isn't directed around world building for once. Maybe doing something other than adventure. How about a fantasy detective story, or a fantasy rom-com? I don't know, something? Enter The Owl House, a fantasy found family slice of life story which already hits so many of the things I love and don't get enough of that I was actually kind of suspicious at first. It's like, hey Lily, here's a story featuring all your favorite things and your favorite voice actress as a sassy gay witch. And I'm like, alright, what's the catch, Disney? There's always a catch with this stuff. Where's your black rocks and fantasy racism? Which pretentious asshole is making this show? One of the directors for DuckTales. Alright, I'll come out and see where you're going with all this. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised, and I'll be bent over a barrel and railed like a tavern wench if that isn't exactly what happened. Before I get into the synopsis, I gotta say, there's a beautiful misdirection in the first episode where it starts out with your typical fantasy setting with a dragon and a good witch going through cliche fantasy dialogue until the good witch... how do I put it? Kicks ass.
Now eat this, sucker!
No! My only weakness! Dying!
Now, with how good that exchange is, if this had been the premise of the show, I'd have loved it. But the actual premise is even better. The Owl House follows the story of Luz, a highly creative and highly destructive teenager with a fixation on fantasy, gore, and gross-out humor, who gets magicked away to an alternate dimension while her mother thinks she's in summer camp that's intended to teach her how to be creative without being an overly destructive nuisance to everyone around her. Instead of going to what I can only assume is Camp Kodiak, she instead comes under the tutelage of Ida the Owl Lady, a vagrant witch who sells stolen human oddities voiced by Wendy Malick. Luz decides to stay instead of going to not Camp Kodiak and learn magic from Ida because that sounds a lot better than learning to balance your hyperfixations with your ability to get along with other human beings. Yes, I will elaborate on that highly contentious read of the introductory scene in a bit. Hold your horses. So the show is described by the creator as a comedy horror, and much of the imagery certainly makes that clear, but I find that so far the show is predominantly slice of life. Most of the conflicts involve personal growth or the relationships between other characters. There's a general underlying theme of emotional maturity, which some people erroneously call a coming-of-age story. There's a general theme of maintaining suspicion of systems that unfairly award power to others and maintaining your own individuality. And in particular, I like that it has a pretty nuanced take on that subject. Here's what I mean. In one episode, there's an introduction of covens, which are basically workers' unions. Ida doesn't like them because joining one means you have your magic sealed off to only use one particular school of magic, and by not joining one, Ida can use every kind of magic. This is why she's so powerful and versatile as a spellcaster. She imparts this wisdom onto Luz that individuality is good while conformity is bad, and Luz accepts that, obviously, but also goes to check out the covens herself anyway.
I get it, Ida. Coven's bad, individualism good. But I'm still figuring this world out, so I'm going to go in there and make up my own mind, okay?
I love that because Luz is actually taking Ida's advice by going in and seeing what's on display for herself and not just blindly conforming to what Ida tells her to believe. And I know it seems like I'm splitting hairs, but that kind of thing is a good sign of things to come. It gives me just a little bit more confidence that the series isn't going to turn into some edgelord's fanfiction wet dream, or a miserable angst fest and shipping bed death nightmare, or the deranged fantasies of a bootlicker who's developed carpal tunnel from masturbating to anime too much. Mind you, the early warning signs are still there. Already the sad sacks are asserting that the show is explicitly made for the fandom metagame nerd crowd, and the fan theory brigade is already making wild guesses, from Luz and Ida being related, to them being the same person, to Ida being Luz's mother despite her actual mother looking a lot more like her, to Luz's father having been on the Boiling Isles at some point, to Ida training Luz because she knew her father and wants to honor him, to Lilith having a tragic backstory that'll make her a good guy. Good fucking lord. You can already see the fandom trying very hard to twist and mutate the Owl House into being just another New 10's serious animated show. Just another one. Yes, I know I harp on about this a lot, but if you're still showing the symptoms, then keep taking your medicine, motherfuckers. The Owl House could maintain its strong opening by sticking to the basic premise of a horror comedy series, as everything is mostly centered around the small region everyone lives in and local government thereof. It'd be very easy to stick to the solid characters and their relationships to one another while still covering that whole oppose an unjust system story that's been running as an undercurrent through the whole show. It would only be a mistake if the creators looked beyond the Boiling Isles and got completely sidetracked with filling in the map. Ida's relationship with her student and how they both encourage encourage each other to grow up? Good. What's past the ocean? Not so good. Are we all clear? Moving on to characters, I find people's favorite tends to depend on what they personally enjoy in a story like this. If you're the kind of person who thought Draco Malfoy deserved a redemption arc and Kylo Ren shouldn't have died, then chances are your favorite is Lilith or Amity. If you're someone who gets way too worked up when one particular person is involved with a project, your favorite is probably King. For everybody else, it's definitely Ida.
You were defeated. Don't get heated. Get your stank face treated.
Rhyme one more thing. I dare you!
Ida is probably one of the most enjoyable mentor characters I've seen in a while. It helps that she's voiced by Wendy Malick, who just exudes a kind of chaotic energy into everything she does. This is the first time I've enjoyed the elderly, wise but cynical mentor character since Kreia. In fact, she's kinda like Kreia, but clearly designed with a different theme in mind and also a different genre. She's basically a big walking mouthpiece for the theme of individualism and remaining suspicious of authority, but the theme isn't being bungled so far like it is in so many other shows, and Ida's personality is so off-the-walls bonkers that she's fun to watch even when she's soapboxing.
You cheated. Perfect Prissy Lilith cheated. Hot dang, I love conventions. I only did that because I knew you would cheat. Still cheated. Welcome down to my level.
Actually, now that I think about it, she's overall just a better example of the kind of character Luke Skywalker was trying to be in the recent Star Wars movies. A wise old magician who's detached from society to a certain extent, and the general attitude that is dismissive of institutions, but without the stupid and contrived explanation for how he got to that point. I think what sells it is that Ida is generally an enjoyable character, even if you don't agree with her, and she doesn't have a backstory that makes everyone with 2 brain cells go,
"Your mistake was hesitating."
Wendy Malick as a sassy gay witch version of Kreia is better than Mark Hamill as a poorly written fanfiction angst version of Kreia, is what I'm saying. She's arguably the main selling point of the entire show, a fun and delightfully weird character who perfectly establishes the mood. Luz herself trails only slightly behind simply by virtue of the voice actress not having quite the presence as Wendy Malick does. A fantasy-obsessed shut-in who has no friends and needs to learn a hard lesson about keeping one eye on the real world so that she doesn't crack someone's skull open with a rock the next time she's throwing fireballs at a dragon. Yeah, time to pull that pin out, because as much as the first episode really wants you to sympathize with Luz being told to rein in her creativity, the reality of the situation is that Luz is an obscenely disruptive and destructive influence to her school and the people around her, and is in desperate need of a few lessons in impulse control. I'm not too bothered by that though, because Luz is kinda getting that reality check she was scheduled for on the Boiling Isles anyway. A lot of her behavior is explicitly put through the ringer in many episodes, with one having another character outright call her a bully. It's clear that while the opener may have tried too hard to get us to sympathize with someone who does very much need a reality check, this character is on the Boiling Isles for the express purpose of learning to grow up a bit. It's not just learning magic for the sake of a fantasy adventure. Luz is getting a stealth lesson in emotional maturity while she's at it. There's one episode where her sheer desperation to sink back into her fantasy world when the Boiling Isles proves not to live up to her expectations actively gets her snared in a trap that King was warning her about numerous times, but she ignored because OMG, the quest!
It offered something you needed, and you didn't even try to stop yourself.
Luz almost gets herself enthralled to a demon because she simply cannot take her head out of the clouds for 5 seconds. That's a pretty cold opener for the second episode, and I desperately hope all the people doing the fandom metagame nonsense absorb that before they get too involved in their OMG, the world building. Almost every episode has to deal with Luz learning that magic isn't a toy, and that being so impulsive and not thinking is only going to get herself and the people she cares about hurt. Especially the episode where she steals Ida's elixir to gain magic powers, but in reality the elixir was medicine for a curse Ida has that almost gets all of them killed. And I gotta say, I like how the concept of a curse is used here, awkward segue. So we all know that cartoons these days are going hog wild with metaphors and using metaphors as an excuse to not have to address uncomfortable subject matter. The 2 most hilarious examples I can think of are Star vs. the Forces of Evil doing a whole story about systemic racism, and despite having an absolutely perfect vector for that, decided to do some stupid deranged Mumin versus monsters conspiracy lunacy. Even more hilariously, Steven Universe's executive producer claimed on numerous occasions that Steven's whole rose and pink diamond identity crisis was a metaphor for transgender kids, even though nothing about those 2 things lined up at all, and read like she only read the first half of the first paragraph of the Wikipedia page for what transgender means before getting bored and going off to binge more weeb trash. But the Owl House goes in the opposite direction, using the language of a real-world issue as shorthand to get a point across when the real world is simply inaccessible. Ida's curse is treated exactly like a chronic illness, and she has to take her elixir regularly or risk turning into a raging owl demon. There's even an episode where Ida needs to get more of her elixir and gets price gouged by a greedy pig.
1,000 snails? What kind of game are you playing?
Capitalism, where everyone wins except you.
Let's play a game called Guess What Country Dana Terrace is From. But yeah, not only does Ida deal with a chronic condition, she also has to deal with an opportunistic healthcare system that will take advantage of her for profit. See, this is the good kind of metaphor because it's making the exact same point you were going to be making regardless and understands the subject matter perfectly. Actually, no, it's not even a metaphor. It is literally just an episode about predatory healthcare and the issues therein. And even when the show is talking about something serious, it still maintains a relatively lighthearted and positive tone. It's almost like you can take something seriously without having to be a morose defeatist emo about it the entire time. They even do the whole Draco Malfoy thing well, as there's a wizard school alpha bitch named Amity walking around, and Luz has this whole rivalry thing with her for a couple of episodes, and by the end of it, when she's been thoroughly humbled and brought down a peg, her and Luz don't become friends. In fact, Amity just wants Luz to stay away from her because Luz keeps getting her into trouble through her reckless disregard for everyone around her. It comes back to Luz seriously needing to learn some damn impulse control and that she can't just quirk her way through the entire story. I'd say that these are all good signs of a creator who knows what they're doing, which makes sense as Dana Terrace has previously worked as a storyboard revisionist on Gravity Falls and as a director on the first season of the DuckTales reboot. I didn't cover either of those shows despite watching them. In fact, I actively lied about watching Gravity Falls because I didn't want to be interrogated on it by you guys, but both of those shows did understand who they were actually made for and that the adult viewers were always a periphery demographic. So Dana Terrace strikes me as being of a different caliber than the fanfiction dropouts and weebs. It also helps that the show has writers. Like actual writers for once. Everything in here has me interested enough to see it through the first season, which is usually when the cancer of fanfiction cliches tends to manifest in a show, if it's going to at all. But for now, everything fills me with confidence that the creator isn't out to prove how clever they are and just wants to make a show that's actually fun. The Owl House gets a tentative recommendation. As I always warn you guys, there is the possibility, and indeed many openings, for this show to disappear right up its own ass like Star vs. Entangled did. I've been wrong too many times to not have that warning in these first impressions. So I give it a recommendation with the caveat that the moment it does any of the following shitty tropes, then I will immediately schedule the executive producer to be smacked across the head with an Ultra Sabers prop. Alright, I'm done. I'm gonna go back to bed because I'm a sleepy little owl. She imparts this wisdom onto Luz that individuality is bad. Well, I completely mixed that up. Wow.